Merci, thank you very much. What a pleasure to be here, and you'll hear in a moment why it's particularly exciting for me to be, in a sense, back in Prince Edward Island. And before I get to that, I just want to talk about what has been this unique partnership between Via Rail and CBC and community foundations, and how, as we learned of the efforts of CBC Radio Canada to take forward this conversation, what we discovered was there were three institutions in the country that were interested in actually connecting the country. The CBC Radio Canada, through the way that they engage us and communicate to us about what's going on, and via quite literally connecting us from place to place to place. Islands maybe not always factoring in, but and then in the case of community foundations, we connect us through our common purpose. There are places like in Prince Edward Island where there's a community foundation in almost 200 locations all across the country, and Canadians come together to work with one another to make the place better. In some ways, it's as simple as that. And so to me, it's sort of indicative of what the country's become, that we have this in place. Maybe not so much institutions anymore, but networks and people connected one with the other with a broader sense of what we're about. But really what I'd like to do is just tell you three stories. Keeps it simple. And the thing that's intriguing about the story, if Peter, you can help me get to the next one, thank you, is that for me it starts very personally with this fellow Peter Wallace Lamont, and it was actually in the year that the Charlottetown conference took place that he was born, and he was born in the islands in the north of Scotland, and at about 13 years old, he was given a gift. His father, and with the community in support of him, he was giving a ticket to Liverpool and then passage on a boat, and that boat successfully made it across the Atlantic, and lo and behold, it arrived here in Prince Edward Island. You might have known the Selkirk settlers had used this as a landing pad, but this wasn't exactly that same group, but it was very much for the same purpose. There were tough times in the north of Scotland. And so this gift allowed him to travel across the ocean, arrive here, and he settled in Belfast, not too far from here. Eldon, he lived there for a period of time, but he lived for 2 years in a farm. The McSwains took him in and not only took care of him, but gave him enough of an education that he developed this fine penmanship, clearly a set of skills on how to both take care of a farm, but also take care of himself. Now imagine this, a 12, 13-year-old boy traveling across the ocean with this gift and then arriving in a place. And after 2 years, which was the agreement with the McSwains and the Lamonts back in Scotland, he was then free to go about his affairs. He did that. He got on a boat and went across to Miramichi, spent 2 years in a clerk's shop, learning what it was to be a clerk, learning both languages, isn't that interesting? And then having saved enough money, and we know of this because of this ledger book, a true Scot, he'd marked down every single purchase in and out, and he then bought a ticket, and he bought a ticket on the train that could go as far west as possible. Isn't that interesting that we're here today, and this fellow, he takes the train, which at that point was to Regina. I told the story in Winnipeg how he stopped in Winnipeg, got off the train, chatted up the telegraph operator, and carried on. And that was relevant because come Regina, and a bit of a lonely fellow there, setting up his own shop, he telegraphed back and suggested to the telegraph operator that maybe she ought to carry on to Regina and join him, which she did. So add up the you add up the dates, and it was just some 15 years later that it was the turn of the century, 1900. And this Peter Wallace Lamont fellow, he's the one standing there, and that's the telegraph operator sitting down just to his right. They'd made a fortune. They'd made a fortune through this clerk's shop in Regina. They went on to make a fortune in Calgary and in Trail in British Columbia and Nelson, not too far away. And that allowed him to carry on and move to the ocean where it was meant to be a little bit warmer and healthier, and settled in Vancouver. The two of them, late in life started to have children, and wasn't that a fortunate thing because their children, or one of their children, was my grandfather, this fellow Donald Lamont, and it was Peter and Mary who had had this amazing life. Okay, so imagine this, a 12-year-old, the Highlands of Scotland, coming off the famine, and then making this way all the way through to Vancouver. So I grew up in Vancouver as a result, and yet there's this funny thing that so many Canadians have where we're connected right across the country, connected both in terms of where we lived and what our history means. But the connections continue on, and for me, with the next slide, what it does is pick up this interesting connection to our work today. Because right at the same time that Peter Wallace Lamont, with his fortune, there at the turn of the millennium, was breaking ground in a home in Shaughnessy in Vancouver, there was a woman named Alice McKay. And Alice McKay was diligently working at the time for one of the barons of the West Coast in British Columbia, a fellow named Van Dusen. And in her work as a secretary, she quietly put away a few dollars. Just tucked it away, and at the end of her life, in her will, she gave that, what was then $1,000, to the Vancouver Foundation. And giving that $1,000, she created the first endowment for that foundation. But not only that, she invited 9 others to join her, or 9 others did join her, in contributing with Van Dusen an additional $10,000. So in 1943, some 70 years ago, at the Vancouver Foundation, $101,000 was brought together because the secretary, Alice McKay, took $1,000 and created what was a community foundation. Now it turns out Peter Wallace Lamont knew those fellows that gave the $10,000, the Van Dusens, the Woodwards, the McMillans, the Blodells, these West Coast families. And he knew them through his business. But interestingly, as is the circle of life, he wasn't there with $10,000. He'd lost it all. He'd lost it all in the crash in 1929. And so while he was one of that community, he was not, as you would say, able to make that contribution. He'd received a gift, and now Alice McKay was giving a gift. And a little later on in Canada's history, when we came through to 1967, and with the next slide, what we had was someone who was interested in these many different gifts. It's not the one that you know there, Dan Aykroyd, but his father, Peter. His father, Peter, was a public servant who got onto this idea that come 67 and Canada's 100th, we wouldn't just gather together to celebrate, although clearly that happened. We would think about what contributions we could bring forward. As we heard, that played out extensively. But come the millennium in 2000, Peter Aykroyd took this idea and brought it to community foundations, to the very network of folks like the Vancouver Foundation that Alice McKay had established, and like the one that's here in Prince Edward Island. And he said, could we draw together all these many gifts, the many different gifts that Canadians would make, building on 1967 and our 100th, and here at the millennium. And we're talking tens of thousands of gifts were identified. They were brought forward and they were made visible. They were made visible on this interesting new thing that had emerged called the internet, a website in 2000 that people posted and shared their gifts to the country. So this for me is this interesting little weaving together of 3 stories. And in the final slides, you'll really see what I think is the moment at the 150th. It's this mix of a gift, like was given to Peter Wallace Lamont, or like Alice McKay gave, or like Peter Aykroyd knit together through this idea built off of 1967 and for the purposes of the millennium in 2000. But it's also built off of the next piece, which is a piece of courage. To get on the boat to travel across, right? To have the ability to step out and say, my $1,000 will make a difference here in Vancouver. To have the ability to think as big as what happened in 1967, as well as what happened at the millennium, as did the Aykroyds. This is to seize the moment in time, which I think is the third piece. The third piece of a gift, courage, a moment in time, which is sort of what's ahead of us here as 150 approaches. Can we be courageous enough, like the young man who got on the boat, or like Alice McKay that tucked away a few dollars, or as we dreamed about in 1967. But I think the thing that I'd like to close with is that we sometimes miss, as we tell this story, what's been going on when we talk about the people. When we talk about Peter Wallace Lamont, or we talk about Alice McKay, or we talk about what the Ackroyds did, we miss everything that's around them. And that's the community. The community that gathered together enough dollars to send someone across an ocean, or a community that was there to receive the gift of Alice McKay and those 10 families in Vancouver, and most certainly the community in Canada that came together both in 1967 but as well in 2000. So for me, at the moment of the 150th, I think it's a chance to make that community as visible as the individuals. That we'll remember the moment at 150th because of what communities have done together, how we've had both the ability to give our community a gift, but also to have the courage to do something important and to capture that very important moment in time. So thank you so much for being here as one of the partners and for engaging in dialogue. I can't wait to see the results of the discussion that'll take place today and built out through everything that's happening across the country. Merci.
Ian, before you sit down, this is the follow-up question portion of the morning. I think inherent in what you said, you can have a last name like Ackroyd, which is well known across North America, and contribute. You can have a last name like your first two, McKay or Lamont, and contribute in your own way too. I think inherent here is that, you know, the ideas of this guy's important, but so are the ideas of that guy and that guy, correct?
Yeah, that's right. We through this work we're doing with the Governor General right now on building smart and caring communities, one of the things we've sort of captured is that everyone's got something to give. Right? This is this great Canadian sort of sensibility that it doesn't matter whether you're the McKays or the Van Duzens, right, or the Lamonts or the Ackroyds. There's something there, and we can imagine, you know, come the 150th that all 34 million of us get a chance to participate in this, and wouldn't that be the most important thing of all?
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
All right.